Hi guys, Claudia Boleyn here. Today I wanted to talk about Harry and body autonomy. And the reason I wanted to do this is because I've seen a couple of things recently. So there's a new Jimmy Kimmel sketch, which I had the misfortune of watching today, which I'm sure you've seen it. It's referring to a story that Harry tells in Spare, which I have here, which is about how he had frostnip on his genital area. Yes, I am going to say penis in the video, like, we're at that point. And a lot of time had got into this supposed joke, it was this really crude kind of illustration, for some reason making it into a children's book, which felt really creepy. A children's book in which Harry gets frostbite, and then his mother, Diana, is pictured in it, kind of giving him advice, etc. I don't want to get too far into that because it's just really disgusting. And it basically spoke about Freud, and it just implied some really creepy things about Harry's relationship with his mother and his feelings towards his mother. And I just kind of watched that, and I saw the response to it in the comments with people like laughing and thinking it was really hilarious. And I started to think about it from a human angle, because I think we've become so desensitized to the fact that the way we treat celebrities, but especially like the royal family members, Harry, but also the others as well, they don't really have any autonomy, and they're just laughing stocks. I was watching the way people were laughing and finding it so funny, and it just really disgusted me, because by all accounts, even people that don't like Harry know that he was traumatized by the death of his mother, by the early death of his mother. And this sketch actually depicted Diana as part of this, casting aspersions about Harry's feelings towards his mother, which obviously are going to be complex, but it was implying something really sick. And I was kind of thinking about it, and I was thinking, like, how has it got to this point that the media have made such figures of ridicule of Harry and Meghan that they are now using the image of Harry's dead mother, who he lost when he was a child, to further torment him. And again, it made me think of him as a truth teller and a whistleblower in some ways, because they have to silence him in whatever way possible. I've certainly seen a move recently to move more towards Harry. They tried it on Meghan quite successfully, unfortunately, in Britain, and now they're moving to him as well. And I kept thinking about the fact that this is somebody who, I'm more than halfway through the book now, just about. This is somebody who's been hounded by the press all his life and has never actually had body autonomy. His body's never belonged to him. He has been, and this is true with all the royal family, and this is also the argument I would make as for why the royal family shouldn't exist, from a kind of humanitarian, human rights perspective, is because the children that are born in, they're kind of born as mascots, right? They are property of Britain. People feel that they own them. So they don't have normal choice. So I would argue, and this is probably a big thing to say, I would argue that what's happening with George is abuse, essentially. And I'm not saying that his parents are abusing him, I'm sure they love him very much, but the system itself is extremely abusive. And we are watching in real time, while they're ridiculing Harry and Meghan, and ignoring Andrew, they're grooming another one. They're doing the same thing, and it makes me wonder what's going to happen to those kids. And in some ways I think that's why they want to shut Harry up, because I've seen it said that the royal family can only exist if it's kind of distant, right? So you take the personal out of it, and I think that's why the royal family have generally not made any official comments from themselves. Obviously, the allegation is that they're making multiple different stories and feeding stuff to the press through royal experts. But in order to survive, they have to kind of keep that air of mystery around them, which I think is why Diana caused such a problem to them, because Diana was more like on a level with people. She was just more human and more real. But once you start thinking about the fact that the royal family are human and real, you start realising that there shouldn't be a royal family, because the divine right of kings makes no sense today. They're not chosen by God. They're just a random family that by an accident of birth ended up extremely financially privileged, but in other ways extremely traumatized and lacking. They are born as our mascots, and I think reading as far as I have in Spare, it has made me feel sorry. I do feel a lot of sympathy for William, because no matter what people do when they're adults, the sad fact is we've got a system that's still going today where we've seen the eldest child of every generation learn that they don't have their own life. They can't make their own choices. They are property. They're being groomed to a role that they never chose, which means people are going to hate them. Some people are going to love them, but I would say it's not real love. It's a sort of, idealized, perfect love. And it's not something they ever choose. And I personally believe that every person deserves to have body autonomy, freedom of choice. It shouldn't be a system where you have to ask permission to marry somebody, or you have to ask permission to have a beard. That level of pressure on a child. And this is why I do feel a lot of empathy and sympathy for young William, because can you imagine the amount of pressure on that boy? Because we do talk a lot about what Harry went through, which is absolutely horrific, but I would argue that also William's going through an equal sort of hell. It just so happens that his has indoctrinated him in as the heir, whereas Harry's has, at the very least, although it's really traumatised him, it's kind of allowed him to escape. William hasn't escaped, and that's a tragedy. You know, you can feel like what he's done as an adult is not great, but I think you can still feel incredibly sad for that child and that inhumane system. And this is what I kind of want royalists to think about, you know, the fact that, is that something you'd want for your family and your children? These are human beings. The royal family systematically, like by definition, destroys these people, destroys their individuality. If it was happening in any other home, if it was happening in any other setting, it would be called child abuse. It would be called child abuse, you know. But it did get me thinking, because I was thinking about body autonomy, and I just got to a point in Spare where Harry described, I didn't really know much about this at the time, but I know there were pictures of Harry circulating because he'd been doing some strip poker or something in Vegas. And he's got to the point in the book where he's already described being stalked and harassed by press. Like, it's just become a normal part of his life. And I think that's what's so horrific, reading it from a real human lens, and I think that's why it's scary to royalists, because if you're actually reading that from a human level and you're thinking, like, these people are in a goldfish bowl, a golden goldfish bowl, and they've just got used to this level of stalking and harassment and trauma, I really don't see how someone can read this book and not want to tear the whole thing down. Not even from the perspective of like an anti-royalist on principle, which I am anyway, but from for a human level, for the sake of the human beings within it, it has to be torn down. It's abusive, it's not fit for the modern day. We wouldn't accept it in any other family. But Harry talks about how he was out with his friends in Vegas, he was going to be shipped off to a war, he was getting ready for that, he was under quite a lot of stress. He says that he trusted some of the people that came to play the game with them, thought they were just having fun together, and kind of wasn't really feeling up to it himself anyway, but he wanted to kind of play along. He was quite preoccupied by other things. Then the next day he wakes up and his almost completely naked body is plastered all over the tabloids. And I just feel like in this age, in 2023, that just shocked me so much to even think that there were people that thought that was okay. You can't just take a picture of someone without their consent when they're not wearing any clothes. And I don't understand why it's on the front of the tabloids if not to shame him. Like, what was the point of that? Because he wasn't actually doing anything wrong. That's stalking and that's harassment. And I didn't realise, I read in this, that apparently when Harry spoke to his dad about this, Charles was actually really understanding, because a similar thing had been done to Charles. Apparently, I think it was a German newspaper, they printed nude pictures of him that was taken like with this sort of wide lens, you know, like from a distance. I think he was on holiday or something, and I'm just thinking, how can anyone think that's acceptable? That incident on its own, you know, Harry's incident of being out with his friends as a young person and having that happen and having it put on all the papers and being mocked and having your body put out there without your consent on the front of papers, that sort of shaming, that in itself is quite traumatizing, you know. And this is just on top of so many other traumas in this man's life. You know, he's talking about how there were two specific men who would follow him around, and he actually developed a bit of a fear of them because they were just always there stalking him and he couldn't get away from them. He didn't know where they were going to be. Sometimes he'd think he was free of them, and then there they were, never really interacting with him as a human, you know, like he was an animal in a zoo. Sometimes they'd try and rile him up, sometimes they'd shout abuse at him to try and get him to react, and he was living with this every single day. You know, it's really not right. And I was thinking about how everyone is talking about the whole penis incident, right? Like the frost-nipped penis incident. And I was thinking about that in the context of Harry's psychology and Harry's idea of body autonomy. So I want to read you something from the book here, but I also want to say that, just to put it in context anyway, just, you know, just to be fair and be honest, this is coming from a passage where he's done, it's like some sort of charity event to try and get to the North Pole to raise money for charity. So he's gone to the North Pole, he wasn't particularly, he thought he was going to be prepared for it, he ended up getting like frostnip, I think he got it on his face, he got it on his ears, and he got it on his penis as well. He was due to come back for William's wedding, so it was really bad weather, so he knew he had to come back. He didn't want to disappoint. Again, that's a matter of body autonomy, because he can't make a choice, you know, he's expected to be there, he's expected to play the role of the best man in the public, even though he's not even the best man. You know, they all just know, we've got to appease this media, you know, play your role, Harry. And actually in that context it's quite sad, because it's somebody who's actually got like a medical difficulty that to most of us, I mean, if you had like a medical difficulty in your genital area that was like concerning to you, I feel like most of us would think, okay, I've got to go to a doctor about this because this is really bad. And reading it and thinking about how he didn't really react to it, and he kind of went along to the wedding anyway, and it was great pain for him, but he didn't really think about it. Made me think about how detached the royals have to be, right? How detached Harry's become from his own personhood, from his own rights. He couldn't just get it sorted out because he had a role to play. You know, he didn't choose the role, but he's got a role to play, so that's to one side. And I also think that any other celebrity telling this story, you know, say it was an anecdote on Graham Norton or something, you know. So I was doing this charity event, but I had to come back for my brother's wedding. He's drunk and the press is everywhere, and I've secretly got this like frostbitten penis, but you know, we have to perform, so you know, it's all systems go. You know, if any other person had told that story, people would have laughed, right? It's because they're trying to make this hate figure of Harry. But this is what I wanted to read to you. So he's talking about how the frostnip was not healing and it's becoming more of an issue. And again, this is somebody who has kind of learned to just deal with his problems, you know, not make a big deal of things. This is something that to most people, I imagine, who have that appendage would probably think, wow, that's kind of urgent. I need to get that seen to immediately. He says, I don't know why I should have been reluctant to discuss my penis with Pa, or all the gentlemen present. My penis was a matter of public record, and indeed some public curiosity. The press had written about it extensively. There were countless stories in books and papers, even the New York Times, about Willie and me not being circumcised. Mummy had forbidden it, they all said. And while it's absolutely true that the chance of getting penile frostbite is much greater if you're not circumcised, all the stories were false. I was snipped as a baby. And I think people aren't using their empathy again. I think they don't want to. I think they're willfully not, because they don't want to think about how actually appalling it is for the people in the royal family and how we actually need to dismantle it, and we have a responsibility to dismantle it, quite frankly. The level of intrusion in this man's life, I mean, to us, you know, we have the luck, most of us, of being able to have some privacy, you know. We have our own private matters, we have our own private bodies, you know, we kind of, I think some of us even take it for granted that we can make decisions about our bodies, you know, they belong to us. Remember that Harry's not in that situation, neither's William, you know, they were kind of born in at this point as part of Britain. You know, their bodies belonged to Britain. They weren't their own people. They couldn't make their own decisions. You know, and all these people saying, oh, what a weird thing for him to talk about. But literally in the context of what he's saying that from the time he was a child, the papers, and not just the tabloids, we're talking the New York Times, were talking about and speculating about his genitalia. How is that okay? How is that an all right thing? Why was that a conversation that was being had? This is somebody who's been made to feel so distant from their body, from their own wants and needs. You know, he comes to the eventual conclusion that he's going to have to go and see a doctor. And, you know, to most of us, I think, reading that, you know, if you have a problem, you'd think, well, you know, I'll call the doctor or I'll try and make an appointment. It's not so easy for him. You know, it comes with a lot of baggage. Listen to this. I needed to see a doctor ASAP, but I couldn't ask the palace to find me one. Some courtier would get wind of my condition and leak it to the press. And the next thing I knew, my todger would be all over the front pages. I also couldn't just call a doctor on my own at random. Under normal circumstances, that would be impossible. But now it was doubly so. Hi, Prince Harry here. Listen, I seem to be having a spot of bother with my nether regions, and I was just wondering if I could pop round, and I asked another mate to find me very discreetly a dermatologist who specialised in certain appendages and certain personages. Tall order. And again, people aren't coming at this with any empathy. This is somebody who doesn't feel like they own their body, who's got something quite severe going on with their body. They've been taught not to make a fuss, so they wait till it gets pretty bad. And then they think, you know what, I can't even go to the doctor and trust that it's going to be confidential. Because this is somebody who his whole life, his body has been public property. So him now telling the story, it's such a twisted form of gaslighting, really, that this is somebody who's suffered this all their life. You know, a situation where their body wasn't theirs. The tabloids and the papers and the media really did think they owned his body and could talk about it as they wanted and that they had a right to know these things. And yet when he talks about it, you know, I've seen people saying, you know, it's too much information. But then that is the cost of body autonomy and freedom and being positive about our bodies, right? People have different tolerances, different things that they're okay with sharing, people that they're not. It's about consent. And I was thinking about this perspective and how it might be different from other people and, you know, different to ours. And, you know, straight away I kind of started thinking, well, this is something that the press have spoken about for a really long time. In some ways to him, this is taking ownership. I also wanted to think about this in terms of how we might think of something like revenge porn, and we think about consent and we think about body autonomy. Because, you know, there's the passage here where Harry has done the strip poker or whatever game they were playing, and it's ended up in the press, and this is his reaction. Until the next day, standing outside the hotel in the blinding desert sun, I turned and saw one of my mates staring at his phone, his mouth falling open. He told me, Spike, one of these blackjack girls secretly snapped a few photos and sold them. Spike, you're everywhere, mate. Specifically, what was everywhere was my arse. I was naked before the eyes of the world. Billy the Rock, now studying his phone, kept saying, "This isn't good, H." He knew this was going to be hard for me, but he also knew it wasn't going to be any fun for himself and the other bodyguards. They could easily lose their jobs over this. I berated myself. How had I let it happen? How had I been so stupid? Why had I trusted other people? I'd counted on strangers having goodwill, and counted on those dodgy girls showing some basic decency. But now I was going to pay the price forever. These photos would never go away. They were permanent. They'd made a foot tattoo of Botswana look like a splodge of Indian ink. My sense of guilt and shame made it hard at moments to draw a clean breath. Meanwhile, the papers back home had already begun skinning me alive. The return of Hooray Harry, Prince Thicko strikes again. I thought of Cress reading the stories. I thought of my superiors in the army. Who would give me the heave-ho first? And it really shocked me that his whole reaction, this is something that's been done against his will. This is something that I'm pretty sure would have to be actionable, wouldn't it? It's like sexual harassment. You know, you can't just take secret pictures of someone naked, sell them and then publish them, you know, and put them all around the country so everyone sees it. And yet he's thinking, how could I have been so stupid? This is my fault. The victim blaming of this whole system. He wasn't to blame for living his life, and it wasn't the tabloids' business, it wasn't any of the press's business to put those photos anywhere. It was just another way of them showing that they owned him. And also a threat to William, because it's a threat to the others, because it's saying, look, this is how low we can go. You know, we will do this to you. You're not people to us. You are animals in a zoo. So you better perform for us, because if you don't, we'll stalk you anyway and we'll find something. So you better work with us. Like, that's the threat, isn't it? So I was thinking about all this stuff and how it applies to social justice and how it applies to abuse dynamics in our lives. And I kept going back to that Jimmy Fallon sketch that I'd watched, which had made something which I think most of us would deem oversharing for our perspectives, but ultimately, whether or not it's the way we would have spoken about something, it's somebody taking ownership of their own story and talking about their own feelings and their own life and their own body. So, and this is somebody whose body has never belonged to them and has long been subject of kind of public scrutiny, you know, has felt like they are property of the whole country. And I don't see these comedians and figures, you know, talking about the tabloid press and talking about the fact that, you know, maybe these people have focused on this about Harry for so long that maybe for him this is fight back, right? That they put him through such trauma and stalking and harassment, a kind of sexual harassment in some way. And now in talking about his own body, he's been made into a figure of ridicule. It takes out the abuse dynamics and it's just there to humiliate a victim. You know, and it does something really wicked as well, because it also brings in the biggest trauma of Harry's life, which is losing his mother. And it's putting her in that sketch and actually taking the time. This isn't just like a kind of offhand joke that someone made and then regretted. They drew this out. They drew this whole thing out specifically to further traumatise and humiliate him on such a huge scale, with his mother and these ideas that there was something sick or uncomfortable about their relationship with each other, taking one of the only things that Harry has found solace in his life and turning it into something like that is incredibly abusive. And, you know, this is why you know it's so fake. You know, I've seen people argue, you know, oh, it is uncomfortable, it is weird, there's a weird thing going on there. The way you know that they're not sincere is because if they truly believed that Harry as a child was so traumatised by the loss of his mother that this was something that had happened to him and this weird relationship had developed, right? If they actually believed that was something that had happened to a child, they wouldn't then be ridiculing that person as an adult and making it into a huge joke, would they? They'd be thinking, wow, what an awful thing to happen to that kid, let's help them. They're not trying to say let's help, they're just trying to laugh and humiliate him, which shows you that they don't believe there's anything weird or sinister happening. It's just the absolute lowest thing they could possibly do. They've already tried to have his wife kill herself, right? They've come for Meghan. So now they are so sick that they're actually attacking the relationship between mother and son. The one thing that Harry can cling to about his childhood and those memories he has of her. And they're using that. I don't understand why that's supposed to be funny. I don't understand why everyone's laughing at it. And I feel the same way about William as well, honestly. I'm seeing so many people saying that because, and this is the victim blaming, because Jimmy Kimmel decided on that sketch and really just pushed it way too far and made those implications, not even implications, they kind of made a joke out of this. I'm seeing people saying that it's Harry's fault now, and Harry is now damaging his own mother's legacy. I've seen countless things. On the Express today, sorry I had to answer the door, but right, so the Express, I saw this earlier, the Express had written an article which said Prince Harry warned against jeopardising his mother's legacy after joke mocks Diana. Now, is that just me or is that incredibly sick? to act like the joke that Jimmy Kimmel made and put effort into doing is now damaging the legacy of his mother. Because they've tried everything else to destroy Harry, right? They've tried everything they possibly can. So now they've stooped to the absolute lowest form of psychological warfare on somebody that was traumatised as a child, and they watched. These people were old enough to see that little boy walk behind his mother's coffin in public, and now they're doing this. And they accuse Harry of ruining his mother's legacy. This is something that people need to understand. Diana was William and Harry's mum first and foremost, right? They loved her more than anybody else in this world, and they knew her better than anyone else in this world. They are her children, and they were her life. You know, she absolutely adored them. You know, we know that from her life. She adored those boys. And it's fine to criticise either one of them. You know, I certainly have criticised a lot of William's actions. But something that I find particularly wicked and that I would not engage in is to try and tell either of those boys that they're ruining their mother's legacy, because no, that's their mother. They knew her and they loved her and they lost her. And Harry's spoken about how horrible it was to have to perform and act like, you know, because they had to perform to other people who were upset about their mother's death, but the actual kids couldn't, you know, publicly do that. And with Harry, it got to a point where he felt like he couldn't cry. It seemed like he'd taken himself out of the situation to cope for so long that he became disconnected from himself and disconnected from the grief. And he went through a period of, you know, trying to reconnect with it, because it seems like to protect himself from completely falling apart, he detached at that time and couldn't get back to himself again. This is how sick and evil. You know, it's not just the tabloids. We live in a culture which celebrates abuse, right? It celebrates bullying and mocking people. And you know what? I'm not someone who's going to sit here and be all like, you know, nicey nice, let's all be friends all the time. No, sometimes people are horrible. Sometimes people do terrible things. Sometimes people oppress other people. Sometimes people are hateful bigots. And sometimes people cause harm in the world and they should be called out for that. And it's fine to not like those actions. But it is shocking to me that we still live in a culture where we laugh at abuse victims, right? We laugh at their trauma, we try to re-traumatise them, we try to undermine the trauma. You know, there's no sense of empathy. It's like there is no empathy for Harry, and this is kind of what he talks about in the book. There's not real empathy for him, and I'll be honest, even people who claim to love William and Kate, there's not real empathy for William and Kate from them, because they don't see William and Kate as people. They see them as ideals, right? They see them as representatives of hierarchy and status and the way a woman should behave and the way an heir should behave. And I'm sure that it's been very difficult for them as well. You know, that's not to, you know, let them off the hook for the stuff they've done, but they're not people to these royalists. They represent something, and that's why they back them so hard. Like, and you'll have like women who are like obsessed with being like Kate Middleton, even though Kate Middleton doesn't really say much about her opinions or anything. It's like they've projected onto her, you know, the institution of Britain and how a woman should behave, and it's all very sexist. It's victim blaming on such a horrible scale. I couldn't believe watching that Jimmy Kimmel clip that I could hear all these people laughing. And I don't even mind, it's fine if people don't like Harry, they don't like what he's written, they don't agree with what he's done. But these weren't the laughs of somebody who just didn't like him. These were dehumanising laughs. Like, this was the laughter of somebody who felt like he himself was a cartoon character. Like, Harry wasn't a real person to them. He was somebody that existed for their entertainment, and now they were mocking him, and it was really fun. And nobody on the writing team thought, maybe let's not attack someone who was a traumatised child via the relationship with their dead parent. Like, maybe let's not do that. It just made me so sick. It reminded me of a scene in Joker, actually. You know the film Joker, where there's like the TV host and it's like that kind of mockery of people and that kind of complete lack of empathy and understanding. It really, really reminded me of that. And it just shocked me even more when I'd seen this, that everyone's response was how funny it was. What do you mean how funny it was? It wasn't funny. It wasn't funny. It was just cruel. Are we just sitting there laughing at cruelty now? Like, to attack someone at the most base level, at probably the most traumatic thing that ever happened in his life, and that's what people are now using to destroy him. Like, do they want, you know, they know that Meghan was pushed to near suicide. Do they want the same for Harry? Because that's the way they're acting. That's the way they're acting. And these people saying Harry's ruining Diana's legacy. How do these people genuinely think Diana would feel if they could see what's being done to her youngest child? You know, these people claim that they like Diana, but I guarantee you that at the time they would have treated her the same as they're now treating Harry and Meghan, because that's how, unfortunately, Diana was treated by a lot of people when she started talking about the truth of the institution. And suddenly it's all changed. Now it's in the name of Diana that they're now taking part in the re-victimisation of her youngest and traumatised child. I also wanted to say that I didn't really know much about Jimmy Kimmel, other than, like, obviously I knew his name, I knew Jimmy Kimmel's name, but it really seems that I wasn't aware how kind of right-wing and like abuse apologist he was, you know, I had a quick look and I saw that he's previously done a sketch about the way that Harry describes William attacking him. And it's like a comedy sketch, right? It's having two people actually dressed as Prince, like the musician, acting it out. And it reminded me of how people acted out during the Depp and Heard trial. The audio of Amber describing the alleged abuse, people were then acting it out and mocking it, right? And these were people who said that they cared about domestic violence, who cared about, but they were, you know, it's not something, you wouldn't use it as a joke, right? It's not something that you laugh about. So this was only a couple of weeks ago, we had him undermining domestic abuse and assault, if it's by your brother. He also, in the last couple of weeks, I believe, has accused Harry of throwing his family under the bus one by one. So a lot of abuse apologism there. You know, this is before he'd even read the book or anything. So, you know, I worry about people like this because I always think, well, why are you so much on the side of keeping victims quiet, right? Potential victims quiet. Why would that be in your interest? I always think about that. He also says this, he speaks about how Harry talks about William having beat him up pretty badly. But he says it with joy. He's laughing at the idea that William beat him up pretty badly, in Jimmy Kimmel's words. He's just laughing about abuse. He's laughing about somebody who presumably doesn't like getting beaten up. I was really shocked that this was on the television. Like, this got to air. But, you know, he also does have a history of not being able to spot abuse and siding with the abuser, you know, because, I mean, I saw this clip. I was just quickly doing some research. I saw when Megan Fox, the actress, was on his show in 2009. And, you know, he already has a real sexist kind of mocking tone. You know how a lot of male presenters at the time kind of treated women, especially good-looking women and actresses on their shows? It's kind of like demeaning and condescending, and it's all a bit weird. And he says to her, you know, you're not the typical beautiful actress. And she immediately gets a bit defensive and she says, well, why is that? Because she can sense it. Megan Fox is intelligent, you know, and she can sense that she's going to be demeaned here. But she gets to a point where, you know, they've got a funny segment where they're kind of like drawing sketches for each other because she's into like comic art or something. So she's drawn this little caricature of him and she's put like this comically like ripped torso on him like Superman, right? So and she's put his face on it. And then he's drawn her something back. So I'm thinking, oh, you know, I wonder how he's drawn her. Like, I don't know, like I was expecting, you know, comic style Wonder Woman or something, you know. And he actually came out with this picture he'd drawn of them having sex, right? With him kind of like leering over her in bed, like literally having sex in the picture, which feels like sexual harassment to me. He then goes on in the same interview when she talks about working with Michael Bay. She talks about how when she was like 15, she was on the film set when she was 15. And she was meant to be in like, she was already put in this like bikini and like these high heels and she was really sexualized. But it was brought to Michael Bay's attention that she was only 15, so she couldn't really be in a bar scene. So instead, he decided to put her in a scene kind of under a waterfall shot in her bikini when she was 15, right? She tells Jimmy Kimmel this, which I think most of us at Jimmy Kimmel's age would have thought, wow, what an abuse of power, that's awful. Jimmy Kimmel says that's a microcosm of how all our minds work, but some of us have the decency to repress those thoughts and pretend they don't exist. So, you know, I know Jimmy Kimmel has apologised for saying that, but I think it just goes to show that he hasn't learned anything about abuse dynamics and why is he always making jokes at the expense of the abused or at the expense of victims? Like, he's not learned. I don't mind if people make mistakes. It's fine to, like, make a joke and, you know, you get it wrong and you think, oh, I shouldn't have said that. But this is a pattern, right? This isn't a mistake. This is someone who consistently sides with abuse systems and tries to humiliate victims. Because again, if we look at the wider issue, what's happening with Harry and Meghan is a threat not just to anyone in the public who's some sort of whistleblower who stands up against oppression or any sort of institution. It's also a threat to the rest of the royals. Because I think it would be naive to not imagine that this is actually in play because they realise that the royal family is on the brink of collapse, right? Hopefully enough people are realising that we shouldn't have a royal family. But it's a threat because they're saying, look what we did to him. He left and look, you know, we're trying to make him the laughing stock of the world. We're taking everything he says out of context. We're making people laugh at his trauma and see him as less than human and want him dead, right? That's what we've done to him. So can you imagine what a threat that might be to other members of that family? Can you imagine what that must be like for George and Charlotte and Louis, especially George and Charlotte who are getting older, seeing that happen? Do you not think, it will cross their minds, they're human beings, do you not think they ever think, well, What if one day I want to leave? You know, it's just so awful. It's so awful. But yeah, of course they're reducing a book which is about Harry's trauma and about his experience as basically living a life that wasn't his own, and where he couldn't make his own choices. He didn't own his own body. He didn't really have emotional support. He didn't have any choices in his life. He felt like he had no self-esteem, like he had no worth, and he had to perform. He lived pretty much like a living nightmare psychologically, and was expected to just get on with it. There are so many harrowing things in that book. And still, having read those harrowing things, Jimmy Kimmel decided to go ahead and make that joke, that extended joke, which took so much work, by dragging his dead mother into it. And I mean, in some ways he's succeeded, because what a threat. What an incredible threat to abuse victims that talk about their abuse. You know, to see that so many people are out there willing to laugh at them, to mock them, and just make them feel worse than nothing. You know, to use every little thing that matters to them against them. That kind of ruthlessness is terrifying. Anyway, that's why I wanted to make the video, just because it just really unsettled me, and I'm sure this isn't very well structured. I still have a chest infection at the moment, so not at my 100% full best at the moment, but I just really wanted to read that because I'd read that passage in Spare as I was reading through it, and I just so happened to see that Jimmy Kimmel thing on my Twitter, and I couldn't believe it. You know, this is the kind of thing I remember from like 10 years ago, but it's still happening. And then they wonder why, you know, when these abuse systems are exposed, people ask like, oh, why didn't anyone come forward? You know, how was this allowed to happen for so long? You know, how did these institutions protect themselves? It's because these people, just because they wanted to boost their own careers by going with what was popular, probably scared a lot of victims out of speaking, because if this can happen to Harry, right? And I'm not saying that he's privileged in every way, financially, yes, but not in other ways. But in terms of, this can happen to somebody with his level of money and his level of celebrity, how do they think this is reading to victims watching this play out? And then they'll act surprised when big things break, and they'll say, oh, how could anyone have possibly known? You know, because you guys were part of it. You guys were part of making victims feel afraid and like they're going to be laughingstocks if they say anything. Really, that anything they say defending themselves in their story will be used against them, and they'll be ridiculed, essentially. You know, and there's no empathy. There's no empathy at all. I just want to reiterate the fact that this new sick thing that people are saying about Harry and his feelings towards his own mother is just incredibly sick, and it's incredibly fake. And like I said before, you know it's fake because they're using it as a joke, right? If they genuinely thought there was an issue as human beings, they wouldn't be doing this, would they? It's just a way to smear him in the worst possible, most disgusting way imaginable. That's the sort of smear that's going to make him feel sick to his stomach. And that's what they do in smear campaigns. You know, that's what they do. Anyway, I love you guys loads. Sorry this is so rambling, and I'll see you really soon. Alright, I hope YouTube lets me put this up because I said the word penis in a video. I hope it does. Alright, love you. Bye.